Hey everybody, how you doing? I'm Mark Ross, ITK Radio. With me today is Jeff Moon. Jeff, how you doing?
Great. Thanks for the invitation to be here.
No, this is great. You've had a very interesting career, over 3 decades working at the intersection of both the public side and the private side of, I would say, foreign policy, diplomacy, especially around Asia, especially around China. So it's a real thrill to have you here today to demystify and make us all smarter on what's happening in that part of the world.
My pleasure.
So let's get into it. As we were chatting before we hit record, just from a macro perspective, almost from a college MBA lecture kind of standpoint, what should Americans know about the Chinese Communist Party, just from a macro perspective, like how it operates, how its history, how it's not like the U.S. government, and when we look at it, we shouldn't compare. We should think about it more from their perspective, if you will.
Right. Well, the Chinese system is completely different. I mean, for example, in the press, we talk about President Xi, but in China, he's Chairman Xi. He's not President Xi. There are officials that are presented to foreigners as government officials, but they all have party ranks. And behind them is a party apparatus that is frequently hidden. So it's the Chinese Communist Party, not the supposed government ranks that are trotted out for foreigners. If you go to a province in China, for example, or talk to a local government, and you talk to the governor or the mayor, you're not talking to the top guy. You want to talk to the party secretary. That's the person who has all the power and the person that really is making the decisions. They don't come out and talk to government officials usually, but they will talk to businessmen. If there's something really interesting to them, you can talk to them as a businessman. So the party, the way it is organized, you have the inner core of a half a dozen or so people that make all the real decisions. And what's happened during the Xi Jinping period is that he has emphasized growing and strengthening the party consistently. You can almost any day go dip into the newspapers and see how that is a major priority of his. What he has done is several things that are interesting. One is that he has replaced a lot of the government apparatus with party organizations. Have taken those functions on quite directly, and that's important. What's really important for businessmen to keep an eye on is that Xi Jinping has talked a lot about, has not done a lot about yet, about party apparatus inside the boards of companies in China, including foreign companies. And that means they would want to have board seats, be there participating in deliberations and maybe, quote, contributing to decisions in order to advance the interests of China. So it really is a very different system. The Chinese claim that it is democratic, and that in fact more democratic than the U.S. system, because everyone votes in these party elections. It just so happens that the candidate that the party chooses gets 100% of the votes. So it's quite a different kind of democratic system. But the veneer of the government on top of the party is what you really have here.
Yeah, I know the two things. The president. The use of the moniker president for Xi is it's very interesting, because it's almost, I get the impression that like we're both on either side of the Pacific, we're trying to shoehorn these different words to mean the same thing. And it's also very hierarchical. And, as you know, as a diplomat yourself, like who you're meeting with and where they are, and do we have the same language? And also my understanding as well is there's been a big focus almost on the U.S. government to try to find ways to get even the Chinese government, the party, more centralized, so they can even talk to each other. These ideas around the when we were doing the exchanges and the security economic dialogues, and it was challenging for people at Treasury and Commerce to know that they're meeting with the right people. And that's like I don't know if there's any other government situation that the U.S. has where it's not, they're trying to match up with the right people. You may have a better insight on that, but that's my impression from the outside.
No, I don't know of another place where this actually happens. And what will happen is if there's someone powerful in the party that wants to meet with other people, they will have some kind of government title. For example, Liu He, before he was widely known, was working in the party, but he was meeting with companies with a title under the National Development and Reform Commission, like a deputy director or something. And so they will come up with that, or there will be a title of some, quote, NGO. NGOs in China are all headed by retired government officials, and their purpose is to serve the government. And so, under that guise, they will frequently meet with foreigners as well. But it's interesting how the Chinese government, sticks to this fiction of these government positions, when in fact it's the party that really has the power.
Why is that? Is that just the history of the Communist Party, or is it just because I always think about like post World War II, and to me that was like the big inflection point, creating like the World Bank, the UN, the IMF, and the Washington Consensus, for lack of a better word. I mean, is it just that the Chinese weren't a part of that, so to speak, and now that they're trying to find equivalency, or they do seem to want to be a part of the world, but their structure isn't equivalent, so they've got to kind of jerry rig it, so to speak.
Well, one possibility is that the communists took power, but they took power within a context that was established by imperial tradition. And you could even argue that the communist leaders are new emperors. There's even a book that's been written about this, about how people came in, and you think of the trappings. They even live in the compound that used to house the staff of the emperor. And the way that everything is centralized, the attitude towards foreigners, keeping them all at a distance, the attitude towards how permissive society is or not. Under the imperial system, everything was forbidden except for what the emperor permitted. And if you think about it, there's a lot to that in the current society. So there's a lot of a mindset that was grafted onto communist ideology, and that remains, even though the communist ideology is touted, but has been supplemented, let's say, by capitalism and Chinese competition with Chinese characteristics.
Yeah, one of my favorite phrases. I know the culture code of any country I find really interesting, or any business or any part of the world. I mean, understanding. I want to talk to you about this. Like, China has a long history. It's 5,000 years old. It's an ancient civilization. It's always had a prominent role on the planet, but yet, the party has been in power, I guess, now for like 70 years, and it's an emerging economy. And can you just talk about that juxtaposition? Just in the conversations we've had with diplomats, Chinese diplomats, in the same sentence, they'll say, "Oh, we're very old and we should be respected," but "Oh, give us a break, we're a new country" at the same time. It's interesting.
Well, I'm a recovering lawyer, and there's what you call alternative pleading. Alternative pleading means, if the facts are this way, well, I argue this way. If the facts are the other way, well, I argue a different way. For example, China still claims that it's a developing country and should get the breaks within the WTO and elsewhere that a developing country has. And yet, in all kinds of other contexts, China will tell you that it is a very powerful country and equal to the United States, and needs to be treated with respect, and is entitled to throw its weight around in a variety of different ways. So I think that really it comes down to whatever is most convenient for China. That's the argument that they'll come up with.
Talk about, how do you dissect, as a professional, but you both been outside government, inside government, just trying to understand China? I mean, do you have an approach, like, if somebody's introduced to you, are you really almost a detective, like really trying to find out where they are in the party, or what's the real thing, what's really happening here, who's the real power source? And do you get that just from your experience, or when you see a news article or you read something, how do you dissect it to figure out what's really going on?
Well, I think, there's an advantage to getting older and having some experience, having been around for a while in China, in the US, in industry, in the government, and seeing things from a lot of different contexts. So there are so many examples of where the US and China see things completely differently, and conflict that still exists at this point due to that. And having been around a while, you understand a little bit of some of that context. I mean, for example, right now, the Americans are baffled that the Chinese won't talk with them, that they won't talk about, for example, military issues.
Right.
Well, one of the first things China has historically always done when it is unhappy with the United States is cut off military conflict. And some of the reasons that they don't want to talk right now or establish the mill dialogue that everyone was hoping for before Blinken's visit was, one, the U.S. is sanctioning the current Minister of Defense. That's sort of a problem.
Right.
Two, there was a run earlier in the administration that Secretary of Defense Austin wanted to talk to the party official that really is responsible for defense affairs, not the defense minister. And that was sort of brushed aside. But the real reason they don't want to talk about things like cross-straits issues or stuff like that is that China has very vast claims over the South China Sea. And if it is agreeing to deconflict over American vessels that are floating in the Taiwan Straits or other places that they don't think the Americans should be, well, then that is essentially ceding that argument that they have sovereignty there. Even though we know that the Americans are going to continue to sail in those places, and that I think the most dangerous thing to U.S.-China relations is the possibility of an accident with all those things floating in the ocean and flying overhead. To us, it makes eminent sense that we really do need to talk to each other. But to them, this is a sovereignty issue. It's about Taiwan, and they're not going to symbolically cede any of their claims by entering into this dialogue, at least at this point where things are so difficult.
And that gets back to, the history of China, right? I mean, getting back to what you said, like the new emperors, like this is how China's operated for thousands of years. And it's not surprising that China would respond this way based on their history and their culture code.
You can trace it back. I mean, they could have gone in different ways, but there are so many things that you could really trace historically. The emperor was very distant in receiving anyone. Well, it's very difficult to get to Chinese leaders. The American ambassador in most countries deals directly with the head of state. The U.S. ambassador in Beijing almost never, if ever, talks to Xi Jinping. They always push it down lower into the apparatus to find the counterparts that they're going to talk to. I attribute that to the imperial system as well, in addition to justifiable pride in their history. But you could argue that things have changed a little bit over the past 5,000 years, and the situation is getting a little dangerous to boot.
No, you're right. The amount of kit and the amount of alliances and gear that's going into that part of the world is, I don't want to say alarming, but concerning, because you're right. I mean, an accident is not that far off when you have that much gear and kit floating around. Can you talk about like our short history as Americans, United States, and I remind people that we really didn't have the National Security Council. We didn't have it was after World War II when Truman was president. And we came in and kind of reestablished our national security and put more oversight. Famously, I don't know how true this is, but the idea that Roosevelt was the only guy that knew about the Manhattan Project, and the whole swath of the government were involved. But there's much more coordination and centralization now in the U.S. Can you talk about that? And then vis-a-vis like working with, are the Japanese smart about this? Like the South Koreans? Like what other nations can the United States learn from?
Well, the U.S. developed the apparatus that you talked about in response to the fact that the U.S. became a superpower between World War I and World War II. And then after World War II, the U.S. produced half the GDP in the world and was one of the few emerging countries, that really survived the war intact. And so you needed an apparatus to develop that. And China has done exactly the same thing. When I first visited China in 1984, I can remember Chang'anjia, the main east-west drag, was basically one-story shop fronts all the way. Well, now what you have is all the large ministries and office buildings and things that have come in and have, which physically demonstrate the apparatus and the mechanisms that have been developed to respond to China's growth and its emerging power in the world and its greater responsibilities. So it's the same sort of thing. Other countries have similar, a lot of countries have like a National Security Council or things like that. But, what really matters is the politics and the personalities behind those institutions. You can have a framework, but if there's not, real political juice in terms of the political leaders that are out there and making things happen, then they don't mean a whole lot. A big part of, I think, since I worked in the White House for a while, one of the big parts in developing the White House staff, for example, at the National Security Council, was the fact that Eisenhower, who won the war and then became president, had that military staffing outlook. And he was also very important in developing the permanent staff that gets changed from administration to administration. but
Right.
we now have that framework that continues on. And like I say, with some variations. I mean, I was at the NSC between for last year and a half of Bush and the first few months of Obama, and you could see that there was a framework that was going to continue, but that there will be variations depending on the people in power.
And then how does that what about I'm curious about our allies as well, because German Chancellor Scholz was one of the first people to make the trip, after kind of COVID, and meeting with Xi after his third selection as chairman/president, which was symbolic. And the reason I bring that up, he took CEOs with him. BASF has got a huge investment in a chemical plant, $10 billion investment, which is a generational bet that they're making. They want to make sure that investment comes through. So we started out talking about here in the United States and DC about decoupling. Germany is going and saying, hey, we can't decouple. Now there's this new phrase, de-risk. Can you just illuminate how our allies are playing into even how it's shaping U.S.-China policy? Or is it more subtle, or is it not, quote unquote, happening?
Well, I think you alluded to high-level visits, and in China diplomacy, high-level visits have a great amount of importance because in the Chinese system, everything starts at the government level and then moves down. In the U.S. system, we like to think that everything starts at the grassroots level. HP started in a garage in California and blossomed into something, and the government is supposed to follow along and help the private sector innovate. Well, it's totally different. So in the symbolism of these high-level visits is extremely important especially on the Chinese side, and protocol is extremely important as well. To the Chinese, they would rather have a higher level protocol meeting than actually have a substantive meeting, where the U.S. sees things differently. We want to get stuff done. We don't care as much who it is on the other side. We just want to get stuff done. So this is another example of where things are different. So what a high-level visit by the Germans says to the Chinese people who do not have live access to Xi Jinping, who is never interviewed, live or candidly, what they see in their media is that Xi Jinping is blessing this country and the relationship with that country, and then that permits the business to go on. And the country that is visiting China, and China seeing itself as an imperial power, likes to have countries come visit it rather than the other way around. What the deliverables that are developed during these visits get saved up, and they get delivered at these big ceremonial events, like what you're seeing. So,
right.
So that's why people like Scholz or Macron, go and participate in these things and say things that are potentially embarrassing to their public back home, because that is how business gets done. And conversely, when you look right now at the situation with the U.S.-China relationship, you had Tony Blinken, visiting for the first Secretary of State in 5 years.
Yeah, which is
amazing.
5 years.
Received at the airport without a red carpet.
Right.
On Father's Day, there was social commentary in China about whose daddy Blinken is actually visiting.
Oh, interesting.
And then at a sort of business-like oval table, which is not as protocol-wise, is not giving as much honor as it is, in the pictures that you're accustomed to seeing, with two overstuffed chairs and flowers in the middle where the microphones are, and then they talk as they crane their necks over at each other. So I don't think the New York Times picked up on this, and the Chinese people certainly picked up on this. I don't think that the American public picked up on this. And so the Chinese are doing all they can to, through their protocol and diplomacy, approach the Europeans while snubbing or at least not showing full approval to the American side. Very different treatment.
Yeah, you're spot on about it. I mean, for me, the furniture is so critical, just examining the relationship. And, I've been to the embassy a few times, and we'd sit in these really ornate, amazing, huge chairs. But, as somebody who grew up on campaigns, like working at picnic tables or, just anywhere to do political work, it's super interesting when you get in these situations. But all that imagery is super important, and you're spot on. Like the flowers, the size of the table, who's at the meeting, where's the meeting happening. I remember famously Obama tried to have that Sunnyland summit out in California with Xi, and it was decided to be a much more intimate, almost family style setup. They were sitting close together. But understanding that, I think as a business person or as an American, the imagery we need to be a bit more sophisticated about.
Well, Americans have this fantasy that if two leaders just look each other in the eye and say hello and get along, well, all the problems in the world can be solved, and that really let your hair down, you take a walk, and that's the way to really get people relaxed and away from their advisors and get real stuff done. But frankly, that's just not how the Chinese do it. I've been in the U.S. In situations when I was working for companies that some visiting Chinese delegation came, and it was embarrassing because the Americans didn't understand the kind of protocol that the Chinese expected. And so I had to step in and sort of say, no, this is the way you do it. You're going to sit at the front with 2 chairs and have a little polite small talk for 5 to 10 minutes before the formal meeting comes in. When you let people in, maybe let people talk a little bit. And the Chinese etiquette is extremely awkward for us. You're awkward. You're uncomfortable when you're sitting in those chairs, even though they're And so that's again part of the friction between the two systems that we have to overcome, just due to there's no right or wrong. It's just that this is a difference in culture.
Talk about the. You've worked at very high levels in the public side for the U.S. government. You've also had serious jobs with private companies. I'm really curious now about this commercial versus competition, I guess, situation, and maybe it's always been there, but we're entering a very interesting stage with the U.S.-China relationship. I think about the 2009-2008 crisis, and there was a huge pivot to China, a lot of interest, future of growth. The headline stories back then, very sunny, very positive. Golden age, Cameron hosting Xi, and this idea of like the Brits and the Chinese getting along forever. And then, I don't know, something happened over the last 10, 15 years, and it could be geopolitical, it could be the maps, it could just be, I don't know, the Chinese are bored with us, they're sick of dealing with our shenanigans, but there's still a huge commercial interest in China, and but there's more competition. Can you just talk about the current state of play and why you think we're here now?
Well, what's really interesting to me is that the U.S.-China relationship has been like a sine wave that goes up and down and up and down. When Nixon first opened up, there was this euphoria that lasted until, say, 1989, when you had the Tiananmen massacre. And things, it took a long time for things to come back. And that culminated in China getting into the WTO, say, in 2001. Then you had the financial crisis later in that decade, and the Beijing Olympics, where there was a lot of nationalism.
Right. Like 2008.
Right. And there's also been this fantasy on the Chinese side. A lot of scholars have written about this over the years, that the U.S. is about to implode and China is about to take over. So the financial crisis validated a lot of that, and there was a lot less confidence, I think, in the United States. Starting about 2010 or so, and this was when I left government and went into the private sector, there were a lot of companies. There was a Harvard Business Review article, I think it was, that talked about how you need to have a China strategy. Everything is going to depend on China. So it was a big buildup on the commercial side.
Right.
A couple years later, Xi Jinping came in, and there was indigenous innovation and procurement restrictions, and that boom really didn't happen, quite in the way that we thought it would, and the nationalism has increased, and relations have soured as the business community has not really achieved the kind of opportunities that it thought it would. And the business community, as a result, has, you can also look at the arc of the business community's influence. Back when China got into the WTO, the business community was fully behind that and had a lot of sway in Washington. Now the business community's influence is really dissipated, and there has been pushback on a lot of these regulations that have been put in, but the business community can't carry the day. And then the Trump era really started us in a completely different direction, where, as opposed to the sine wave going down again, as opposed to having a consensus to engage, there was a consensus to get a lot tougher. What's been interesting for me on the business versus the official side is that you are watching the same situation, but from a very different angle. And the difference is very important. When you're in the government, remember the government in the Chinese system is what decides everything. And without the government agreement, you can't do anything. So as the US government, you are talking to the Chinese as an equal. You're talking to Chinese officials as an equal. You're negotiating back and forth. There has to be a certain amount of respect because you're talking government to government. When you're talking as a businessman in the Chinese imperial system, you are a supplicant. You are a supplicant seeking favor from the Chinese government, and they withhold or grant meetings, depending on how they think that you are serving Chinese interests. And the meeting starts with the business people talking about all the great things they're doing to help China. And then maybe towards the end, or middle or the end, you get to what the business would really like to have happen, or some approval that they would like to receive, or some deal that they would like to get to. And then at the end, of course, there's the reminder of all the great desire to help China in its plans. So totally different conversations, totally different attitudes between whether you're a government official or you're in business.
That's you're dropping some real nuggets. I love it. No, you're kind of where you sit is where you stand, and what chair you're in, big or small, really dictates. Talk about as we wrap up here. We're entering. There's three things I think currently there. Well, maybe three or four. The Russia-China relationship, the no limits, Ukraine, right? I guess that's one bucket. We're entering a hostile. I'll say hostile, but a classic 2024 election. Here in the States, there's 13 Republicans running, maybe a few more get in. So it's going to be a lot of campaign fun that's going to happen over the next 12, 14 months. And then the China economy, it seems to be a bit sluggish. At least that's the news reports that are coming out recently. They seem resistant to kind of getting back to 08, 09, kind of dump a lot of money in. And Xi, really trying to put the party back in control, really less entrepreneurship, if you will. Is that what you're seeing in China? And then are you bearish, bullish, or is this just the reality of the situation?
Well, quickly, let me see if I can remember the point. First is Russia.
Yeah, just like the no limits relationship. And I think Xi and Putin have met nearly 20 times. And what is that all about? Like, what's the real story? What's happening there?
It's a marriage of convenience. The Russian, there is no long-term alignment between the Chinese and the Russians. The culture, the language, everything is completely different. Nothing really in common. What Xi is doing is playing the game that Nixon and Henry Kissinger played by trying to play the Russians along with the Chinese against the United States and the West. And that's basically what that's all about. And the events over last weekend with the rebellion show us that that's a very tricky game. And relying on Putin may or may not pan out. He's 70 years old, and who knows whether there are cracks in his system. We won't, in an authoritarian system, you don't know until it's happened. So we really can't know. And if I were Xi Jinping, I might be biting my fingernails thinking about what might happen. In terms of the election, yes, historically, when there's a U.S. election, rhetoric, anti-China rhetoric increases. Remember Clinton talking about coddling dictators and things like that. And, everybody on the campaign trail says things that don't help the relationship, let's say. Fortunately, the Chinese realize that, and they're willing to give a little bit of leeway back and forth. What you really need to worry about, though, is Taiwan, because Taiwan is the most important issue to the Chinese. Sovereignty is the most important issue to the leadership in maintaining control. And so if there are statements out there and maybe even legislation proposed that would alter that dynamic in a way the Chinese don't find acceptable, then anything is possible. And that could be quite serious. You talked about the Chinese economy a little bit, and you're right. I mean, there are just figures out within the last 24 hours that show that manufacturing and consumption and employment are all down and decreasing. Don't know if that's a long-term trend, but what we do know is that there are really structural long-term problems here. There's a lot of debt out there. There is youth unemployment. The real estate sector plays an enormous role in the Chinese economy and is very weak, and the business case is faltering. In the meantime, there are increased costs in the Chinese manufacturing system
Right.
and aging population. So, there's a lot to worry about over the long term. What I would really be more worried about in the short term is the tech rivalry that's going on. This is going to get worse. And there are new export control regulations that are rumored to be coming out. There are new outbound investment regulations that are rumored to be coming out. The Commerce Department just finalized its Information and Communications Technology and Services Supply Chain rule. It's referred to as ICTS, not something that's been getting a lot of publicity, but this could ban Chinese participation in all kinds of IT areas, including foreign apps such as TikTok. And so this is something that we're definitely going to be hearing more about. In the meantime, there are other supply chain disruptions that are being caused by the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act,
Right.
In all kinds of sectors that are being affected, where Americans, producers and purchases can't get things like flooring even. Most recently, for example, which is going to affect things. There's a lot to worry about. There's the crackdown on business in China, and all of these things are really presenting a dicey situation. So you asked if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I mean, I think we'd be lucky to maintain the status quo because there are a lot of downside risks that are out there.
Well, that's not a fun way to finish, Jeff. But a realistic version. It is, yeah. There is this localization push. It's almost like we're gonna have 4 or 5 big blocks, and technology, who controls it, the lack of integration. Even India is way ahead. They've banned a bunch of apps, and they want their own system. I think about the European Union is way behind. They really don't have the technology companies that we enjoy here in the United States or in China, and what role they want to play. So yeah, the tech space, I think you're spot on, and it's a place to watch. And it's complicated because how do you build a modern economy? Do you do it all internally? Do you do it with friendlies, or do you do it globally? And I think we're about to enter a stage, almost a new experimental stage.
Yeah, well, China has become prosperous during an era where U.S. and Chinese interests were complementary. Basically, the Chinese provided labor and logistics, and the U.S. provided the know-how. And over the past 10 years, the Chinese have said, no, we're not interested in that anymore. Not only do we want to compete, but the China 2025 plan issued by the Chinese government says, first, we're going to push foreigners out of the domestic market in key technologies, and then we're going to push them out of international markets. So China has experienced sort of a surprise that people don't necessarily agree with that plan, and they're actually kind of pushing back on it. So this explains a lot of the tension here. I mean, it's surprising to me that it's a surprise to the Chinese that this is how it's working out.
Yeah, I mean, Americans are friendly, and we want to compete in a free market. But I think it's an interesting. How do you build up a modern economy is what's interesting for me from a macro perspective. In many ways, it seems like China has done all the easy stuff. If the two of us were to start a new country, we would probably go the route the Chinese did. But how do you build a Google, or how do you build a Cisco? And I love your analogy too. You're right. Like in the U.S., I hadn't really thought about that. Like we kind of prize the entrepreneur in the garage, and this idea of almost regulatory entrepreneurship. We'll just massage the laws to fit the business model in the U.S., where the China has a totally different system. That was really insightful.
Yeah, I mean, and what goes with that is the fact that the Chinese first instinct is to regulate. I have hosted Chinese visitors, official visitors in the United States, and whenever you give them a presentation or something like that, their question is, well, what's the government's role in this? How's the government going to control it? Well, I remember back in the 90s, the head of the FCC was giving speeches about how proud he was that the U.S. did not regulate the internet, because that was allowing the private sector innovation, and the government was just there to help facilitate that kind of innovation. Totally different attitude towards this. And again, that stark difference is not fully appreciated always by folks here. when they look at the Chinese regulation, which we perceive as trying to prevent market access, which it is, but they have a much greater inclination for the government to play a role in everything and to regulate everything.
Well, with that, Jeff, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. You dropped a lot of insight, a lot of knowledge, and yeah, I myself even learned a few new things, so which is great. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.